March 23, 1945, at 2100 hours, on the western shore of the Rhine River near Wesel, Germany. The binoculars in Aust Wilhelm Steinberg's hands trembled ever so slightly as he surveyed the dimming surface of the Rhine, jotting down notes in his field journal records that would eventually be discovered among seized German papers at Army Group headquarters. American forces have arrived at our revered river, but they are unable to get across. There has never been an army able to force the Rhine under determined German defense in the absence of bridges. In the fading twilight, he had just witnessed a sight that confirmed 3 years' worth of Wehrmacht defensive doctrine. Gun flashes cast light over the western bank. Thousands of artillery pieces were getting ready for what German officers believed would be a conventional river crossing, a process involving many days of setup, fixed bridge construction, and exposed fording sites that their 88mm guns could methodically destroy. The Rhine had shielded Germany for 2,000 years. Even at this late hour, as the Reich disintegrated from both east and west, Army engineers kept assuring their leadership that the river's 1,300-foot span and rapid currents rendered a crossing impossible without prolonged engineering work. 2,000 troops of the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, Black Watch, made preparations to enter the river. They would not use fragile assault boats shuttling back and forth under fire, nor linger as engineers assembled pontoon bridges beneath ongoing shelling, but instead board vehicles that German intelligence had disastrously failed to evaluate accurately. DUKW vehicles, these odd amphibious trucks, had been spotted in both Normandy and Italy, but Wehrmacht analysts dismissed them as specialized landing craft pertinent only to beach assaults and irrelevant to river battles. The mathematical logic of Rhine defense was about to be upended not due to greater firepower or sheer numbers, but by American manufacturing ingenuity that German soldiers never anticipated could be mobilized for their final natural barrier. An extensive misjudgment in intelligence would convert Germany's supposed impenetrable moat into a thoroughfare for Allied tanks. This unraveling had actually started months earlier within German intelligence evaluations. Oberst Gunther Blumentritt, serving as Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later inform Allied interrogators of the Wehrmacht's profound misunderstanding of American amphibious assets. Intelligence documents from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy mentioned the Schwimmwagen, the swimming truck, but German analysts sorted these among the oddities of American surplus, alongside floating ice cream factories and Coca-Cola logistics units. Among the defenders stood Major Hans-Georg Model, the son of Field Marshal Walter Model, attached to the 1st Parachute Army. His diary, recovered following his surrender in April 1945, would give historians a clear perspective on German beliefs regarding Rhine defense. The Wehrmacht's most seasoned staff officers, men who had analyzed river assaults from the Dnieper to the Seine, thought they were familiar with the unchanging tenets of amphibious offensives. Offensives, they believed, required dominant artillery support, advanced bridging gear, and, most importantly, substantial time to create crossings vulnerable to defenders. The first true piece of evidence exposing German unawareness appeared in evaluation files retrieved from occupied headquarters. Hauptmann Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had compiled surveys on Allied gear that referenced the DUKW only 3 times over a span of 6 months. In every mention, they were written off as beachhead craft with no bearing on river combat. The reports gauged that the Americans might have only 50 to 100 such vehicles across all Europe. The actual numbers were astonishing. As of March 1945, the European theater held more than 2,000 DUKW vehicles. The U.S. Army organized them into dedicated amphibious truck units, each equipped with 50 vehicles and specially trained personnel. These units had rehearsed river crossings since Normandy, formulating methods that German reconnaissance never noticed. British forces obtained 2,000 DUKWs via Lend-Lease, incorporating their own operational tweaks. The Canadian military used 800 DUKWs, some modified for use in cold environments. The DUKW's creation showcased American engineering at its most effective. In April 1942, a Coast Guard cutter stranded itself on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts, with no conventional truck able to traverse surf and sand for the rescue. This seemingly minor event triggered a development in amphibious operations that would ultimately contribute to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Palmer Clett Putnam, of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, joined forces with boat designer Rod Stevens Jr. and engineer Dennis Pearson to conceptualize a vehicle that could perform seamlessly both in water and on land. When the Ford Motor Company refused the project, considering it unachievable in the time required, General Motors took on the challenge on April 23, 1942. The team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, worked day and night. By June 2, 1942, just 38 days later, their initial prototype was produced. The finished vehicle mixed a regular GMC CKW2 and a half-ton truck frame with a sealed hull built by Sparkman and Stevens Yacht Architects. DUKW as a name came from internal GMC coding. D representing the 1942 model year, U for utility, K denoting all-wheel drive, and W indicating dual rear axles. The DUKW's flexibility was owed to several breakthroughs. GMC engineer Frank Spear invented the Central Tire Inflation Mechanism, CTIS, the world's first, which let drivers modify tire pressure on the go. With pressures of 10 to 12 pounds per square inch, the tires widened for added traction on mud and sand. At 40 to 45 psi, they worked efficiently on paved roads. A 25-inch propeller, powered by a transfer case from the main transmission, allowed travel in water at a speed of 5.5 knots, while a rudder controlled by the steering wheel made shifting from aquatic to terrestrial navigation effortless. Major General Jacob Devers watched the prototype's initial test in June 1942 and at once requested production on a large scale. The first order was for 2,000 units. By the conclusion of the war, GMC had built 21,147 DUKWs at a record-setting output of 525 per month during peak periods, with each truck priced at $10,750. That amount was about equivalent to the cost of 7 Jeeps, but for a machine whose value would prove beyond measure. In March 1945, the German Rhine defenses had deteriorated to a point that Wehrmacht leaders were unwilling to recognize, even in private. General Alfred Schlemm's First Parachute Army, the most capable German force still left in the West, had been decimated during the Reichswald fighting, suffering losses of 90,000 men either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The reinforcements arriving to defend the Rhine consisted of Volkssturm units, elderly men and boys who had only undergone several weeks of training equipped with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of standard uniforms. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 181st Infantry Division, who was stationed near Wesel, wrote a letter to his wife dated March 20. "The Americans are across from our positions now, numbering in the thousands. We hear their vehicles moving around both day and night. However, the Rhine safeguards us. Not even Napoleon was able to cross the Rhine when it was defended. The engineers have demolished every bridge and our artillery has every single crossing marked and targeted." On paper, these defensive measures seemed formidable. Since September 1944, more than 200,000 civilian workers had been pressed into service to bolster the West Wall defenses and extend them out toward the Rhine. Some 3,000 concrete bunkers and weapons emplacements had been built or upgraded. According to German doctrine, the river offered an ideal water barrier, too broad for assault bridges, too rapid for boats, and too deep for fording. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had taken charge in the West following von Rundstedt's removal, issued directives highlighting German expectations. The enemy will need between 48 and 72 hours to establish effective bridgeheads after their opening crossings. This timeframe gives a chance for counterattacks by our mobile reserves. These reserves consisted of the 47th Panzer Corps with a force of about 150 ready armored vehicles including tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers sent to cover a front nearly 200 miles long. The most serious German failing, however, was their strategic thinking. Wehrmacht doctrine, developed over 5 years of fighting, regarded river crossings as a sequence of deliberate steps. Artillery was to suppress defenders, infantry would launch in assault boats, they would secure small bridgeheads, then construction on bridges would start under fire, and as each bridge was finished, reinforcements would cross, followed finally by armor. Defenders were expected to take advantage of this by focusing their fire and launching counterattacks during each phase. Unknown to German intelligence, the Allies had gathered the largest array of amphibious vehicles ever assembled on the west bank of the Rhine. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs were hidden in camouflaged positions within 5 miles of intended crossing sites. Every vehicle had been waterproofed, thoroughly checked for mechanical issues, and loaded with carefully designated cargo lists to ensure they remained stable in the water. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding officer of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, described the detailed preparations. "We realized this wasn't Normandy with its tides and beach obstacles. The Rhine was about dealing with currents, about finding the right exit points, and coordinating with artillery to avoid friendly fire. We trained for 2 weeks on the Moss River, learning how the DUKWs responded in swift-moving water. The vehicles themselves had been adapted as a result of 3 years' worth of battlefield lessons. Armor plating shielded the drivers and critical engine components. .50 caliber machine gun ring mounts were installed for self-defense. Perhaps most importantly, specialized bilge pumps could cope with water intrusion from small caliber bullets, so DUKWs could keep moving even with holes in their hulls." Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company related how the last briefing went. "They informed us we were going to attempt something never done before. Use DUKWs as the spearhead for a major river assault. These would not merely serve as support vehicles or supply transports once bridges were in place, but as the leading edge. Every DUKW would transport a full rifle squad with their gear, traverse the Rhine, then drive up the opposite bank and deliver troops straight into combat positions." The British forces fielded their own amphibious resources. Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division brought 600 LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each able to carry 30 soldiers. These vehicles were to join the American DUKWs in mounting what would stand as the largest riverine assault in military history. But it was the DUKWs, with their capacity to move effortlessly from water to land, that would ultimately challenge the Germans' predictions. At 1700 hours on March 23, 1945, the largest artillery barrage of the Rhine campaign began. More than 4,000 Allied guns, ranging from 25-pounders up to 240mm howitzers, delivered a 4-hour shelling that made the very air seem like a solid wall of steel and explosive force. German spotters observed that the East Bank looked as if it were boiling under the blows of thousands of shells each minute. Gertrud Heinrich Müller, who manned an observation post near Wesel, tried to count the gun flashes from across the river. "I gave up at 500. It looked like a continuous line of flames stretching in both directions as far as I could see. The sound was indescribable. It wasn't a series of separate explosions, but one ongoing thunder that made thinking almost impossible." Concealed by this bombardment and the darkness, the first DUKWs went into the Rhine at exactly 2,100 hours. The 51st Highland Division spearheaded the attack with the 7th Battalion, Black Watch riding in DUKWs operated by American crews. Every vehicle carried 12 fully armed soldiers along with their 2-man crew. Navigation lights masked to be visible only from behind marked where to enter and exit the water on both sides. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the Black Watch recalled what the crossing was like. "We rolled down the slope and suddenly found ourselves afloat. The American driver just carried on as though we were still on land, but now the water was surging against us. The engine was deafening, and we heard German shells splashing nearby, but with the dark and the smoke we couldn't see much at all. The current proved tougher than anticipated, running at 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. DUKWs set off from points upstream of where they aimed to land, their drivers calculating drift as if charting a plane's course through a crosswind. Some DUKWs ended up hundreds of yards downstream, but since they could drive up any bank with a gentle enough slope, they could exit from wherever they landed. By 2,200 hours, the first assault wave had made it across. German soldiers waiting to hear the sound of returning assault boats for further waves instead heard only the ongoing artillery barrage. The DUKWs had rolled straight up the eastern bank and vanished into the shadows, their troops already attacking German defenses from unexpected directions. With the arrival of daylight on March 24, German leaders began to receive field reports that defied logical explanation. Allied units, armed and supplied, were showing up in battalion-sized groups miles inland from the crossing sites. Rather than the anticipated gradual buildup of bridgeheads, Allied forces appeared to be all over the area at once. Headman Karl Richet, in command of a battery of 88 mm guns set up to defend the crossing area at Rhine, sent a message to divisional headquarters stating, "Enemy armor is behind us. I repeat, enemy armor is positioned to our rear. How did they manage to cross? Every bridge has been destroyed. We haven't witnessed any pontoon bridging. What Reich actually came across were not tanks, but DUKWs loaded with infantry support weapons, mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank guns, which had driven straight from the Rhine to spots 3 miles inland. The amphibious nature of these vehicles enabled them to circumvent German strongpoints that had been established to guard the obvious approaches from the riverbanks. When the morning fog dissipated, the magnitude of the operation revealed itself. Hundreds of DUKWs were continuously transporting men and material across the Rhine in unbroken columns. In contrast to assault boats, which needed engineer teams and could only make perpendicular river crossings at selected places, DUKWs could enter and leave the river anywhere the banks allowed. German artillery spotters reported that amphibious trucks were swimming the river at dozens of locations over a 22-mile sector. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, staff officer for operations with the 185th Division, wrote in his field diary, "The enemy is using a type of amphibious truck in numbers far greater than we expected. Our planning was based on there being 6 to 8 crossing sites where we could focus our fire. Instead, crossings are happening everywhere. Our gun crews are incapable of engaging so many simultaneous targets." The British Second Army's advance at Wesel made use of a formidable mix of DUKWs and Buffalo LVTs. The 15th Scottish Division traversed the river in buffaloes, and DUKWs followed carrying heavy weapons and supplies. By 0800, though meeting intense defense from the 1st Parachute Army, 3 entire divisions had made it to the far side of the Rhine along with their full equipment. At 10 o'clock on March 24, the roar of airplane engines added to the noise of combat. Operation Varsity, noted as the largest airborne operation completed in a single day, began as a vast armada filled the sky above the Rhine. More than 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,350 gliders, with 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops, took part. Rather than the isolated paratroop drop German doctrine had anticipated, what occurred was a coordinated strike in conjunction with the amphibious attack. Oberreiter Franz Weber from the 84th Infantry Division, observing near Hamkel, watched as the heavens turned dark with the mass of planes. Parachutes blossomed in the air like a field of flowers innumerable. We assumed this was the primary assault and believed the crossings on the river to be distractions. Then we discovered that the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their amphibious trucks. The U.S. 17th Airborne and the British 6th Airborne Divisions carried out landings within artillery reach of the Rhine crossings, which the German command never foresaw. Prior airborne attacks had involved dropping forces far behind enemy positions so they could operate alone. On this occasion, they landed just 6 miles from the river itself to support the amphibious assault directly. The interplay between the airborne and amphibious troops greatly increased their collective strength. DUKWs filled with ammunition and medical items were able to drive straight to airborne units' locations, which in earlier drops would have needed to be supplied by air or through contact with ground forces. In the days that followed, wounded airborne soldiers were taken away and returning DUKWs to the Western Bank, a feat not possible during conventional airborne operations. Private First Class Donald Burgett, a member of the 17th Airborne, later commented, "We were fighting at this crossroads when these odd-looking truck boats rolled up. There was no splashing, no getting stuck in the mud. They emerged from the woods like standard trucks, though we knew they'd just come across the Rhine." The crew chief shouted, "Anyone need ammunition?" We wondered if we were imagining it. By midday on March 24, the broader meaning of the DUKW attack became apparent to the German officers. This was much more than a new technique for crossing rivers. It represented a fundamental transformation in amphibious logistics that rendered all their defensive assumptions obsolete. In the past, river assaults progressed through distinct stages: an initial crossing, securing of a bridgehead, bridge building, and then bringing in supplies. Every stage was at risk of counteroffensive. Once in place, bridges became essential but vulnerable spots that drew the focus of artillery and air raids. The DUKWs removed these weaknesses entirely. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, who handled logistics for the 16th Corps, described having set up what he referred to as Duke highways over the Rhine. Supplies were loaded onto vehicles on the West Bank: ammunition, food, medical materials, fuel, and the trucks simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered straight to fighting units. There was no need for riverbank unloading, no switching to other trucks, and no waiting around for bridges to be constructed. At their crossing, according to Sims, they were running 50 DUKWs per hour. Each DUKW transported 2.5 tons of materiel, or up to 25 men. That equaled 125 tons of supplies, or 1,250 soldiers every hour without stop. German forces kept seeking bridges to target, but there simply weren't any, just trucks wading through water. The shock this caused German defenders was profound. Feldwebel Hermann Gutz, serving in the 2nd Parachute Regiment, wrote in his journal, "They have vehicles that swim in boundless numbers. How is an army to halt an enemy that can make any river into a road? Destroying bridges is pointless. They are unnecessary to them." Quartermasters reported surreal moments. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division recounted how he set up a supply depot. He said, "We were 3 miles from the Rhine on the German side, right? And suddenly a DUKW rolls straight out of the water, still dripping, loaded with hot food in insulated boxes. The cooks on the Western Bank had made the meals, packed them in the DUKW, and it just drove directly to us. Hot coffee, right in the midst of battle. The Germans likely thought we were out of our minds." At sunrise on March 25, German military leaders found themselves confronted by circumstances that Wehrmacht doctrine had never considered. The Rhine, Germany's age-old natural defense, had become irrelevant, not overcome, not smashed, but merely sidestepped through American industrial resourcefulness that German military intelligence had considered an oddity. General Alfred Schlemm, head of the 1st Parachute Army, held a meeting of senior officers that morning at a farmhouse outside Brunnen. The remaining account of this gathering, assembled from captured officer testimonies, demonstrates the despair among German leadership. Schlemm is reported to have remarked, "Gentlemen, we made preparations to fight the last war. We counted on the enemy assaulting our fortress head-on. Instead, they simply bypassed it. The numbers were overwhelming. Over the initial 48 hours, DUKWs had ferried upwards of 15,000 soldiers over the Rhine. More importantly, they had also moved 1,200 vehicles, including jeeps, trucks, and light armored vehicles that conventional crossing efforts would have taken days to transfer. Artillery pieces were being carried across and set up to fire from the east shore even before German intelligence verified that any crossing had happened." Oberst Heinrich von Lüttichau, who was in command of the remnants of Panzer Brigade 106, tried to launch a counterstrike near Wiesel on the 25th of March. The war diary of his unit states, attempted assault toward the river aiming to eliminate the enemy bridgehead. Did not encounter a bridgehead in the usual sense. Opposing forces arrayed along a 15-kilometer front with no clear center point. Amphibious vehicles constantly reinforcing all sectors. Couldn't identify a decisive objective. Attack failed with significant casualties. The British had comparable achievements. The Scottish divisions had advanced 6 miles inland by the evening of March 25, relying on unbroken DUKW supply convoys. Royal Artillery forward observers conducted fire missions while traveling in DUKWs, utilizing the vehicle's movement to evade German counter-battery strikes. The events at the Rhine highlighted the gap between American mass production capabilities and the German value placed on craftsmanship. Though German engineering had produced their own amphibious truck, the Landwasserschlepper, LWS, a comparison of output clarified the underlying reasons for Germany's defeat in the war. In several respects, the LWS outperformed the DUKW. While it could transport 20 men, 5 fewer than the DUKW's capacity of 25, it featured superior armored protection. The LWS's use of tracks resulted in better maneuverability across mud and snow. German designers had addressed intricate issues surrounding waterproofing of tracked mechanisms and engineered efficient bilge pumps. As a feat of engineering, it stood out. Nevertheless, Germany manufactured only around 100 units, with even fewer entering frontline use. The LWS's production demanded bespoke parts, highly trained craftsmen for its assembly, and scarce resources for its armor and waterproofing systems. Each vehicle required about 75,000 Reichsmarks to construct, making it 7 times more expensive than a single DUKW. In that period, General Motors constructed 21,147 DUKWs, utilizing pre-existing truck elements and mass production techniques. Its motor, gearbox, axles, and numerous other components matched those of the standard CCKW truck, of which 562,750 units had been assembled. This degree of standardization implied any military mechanic accustomed to trucks could perform maintenance on a DUKW without difficulty. Replacement components were plentiful. Vehicles that became inoperative could be swiftly restored or scavenged for parts. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, chief mechanic for the 462nd Amphibious Truck Company, highlighted this benefit. Throughout the crossing, we kept 90% of our ducts in working condition. When a part failed, we could replace it. If our supply ran out, we could improvise with parts from a normal truck. Such flexibility wasn't possible with a unique German device. This approach to manufacturing extended beyond just totals. US DUKWs were constructed with user-friendliness in mind. Any serviceman able to operate a truck could be taught to manage a DUKW within several hours. In contrast, German machines relied on extensively schooled crews. The American method anticipated that the operators would be civilians turned soldiers with limited preparation. German concepts presumed professional soldiers trained over months. Eyewitness testimonies from both sides of the Rhine underscore the personal nature of this shift in technology and tactics. These stories were not mere tallies or evaluations, but young combatants living through transformation on the battlefield. Private First Class James H. from the 89th Infantry Division recounted his initial encounter with the DUKWs. "We lined up on the West Bank, thinking we'd have to pile into assault boats under fire as we'd practiced. Then these vehicles that looked like wheeled boats rolled down the embankment. A Navy man, yes, Navy, in central Germany beckoned us aboard. I asked him, 'What is this thing?' He flashed a grin and replied, 'This is your taxi to Berlin, soldier.'" The involvement of U.S. Navy crews piloting DUKWs deep within mainland Europe only heightened German bewilderment. Seaman Second Class Robert Moody, who served with a naval unit operating DUKWs for the Rhine crossing, explained how Germans responded. "We apprehended some Germans who just stared at our Navy attire. One of them, fluent in English, kept asking, How is it possible for the U.S. Navy to be here? The ocean is 300 miles away. He just could not understand what he was witnessing. German narratives expose increasing disheartenment as the extent of American amphibious prowess dawned on them. Lieutenant Friedrich Schulzer from the 338th Infantry Division penned a letter discovered after his surrender. They traversed the river as if it were a roadway. They didn't sneak, nor did they dash under protective artillery fire, but simply drove across. Truckloads of soldiers driving through the Rhine. We fired at them, but there were always more. More and more appeared. How could they deploy so many? Unterscharführer Paul Brown, taken prisoner on March 26, told intelligence officers, "We were promised the Rhine would hold you off for weeks, that you'd have to construct bridges we would demolish, that your landing craft would fall easily to our guns. No one warned us about vehicles that could swim. No one warned us you'd be able to cross wherever and whenever you liked. We braced ourselves for an entirely different battle." By March 26, 1945, just 72 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the German defense had entirely disintegrated. What German military doctrine claimed would take weeks was completed in 3 days. The Rhine, long touted by propaganda as a bulwark until the Reich could negotiate, had been breached completely. The figures recorded over those 3 days reflect the scale of the change. DUKWs completed more than 5,000 trips across the river. They carried 15,000 men, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of cargo, and took out 2,000 casualties. Traditional bridge building operations, had they been necessary, would have required 2 weeks for equivalent throughput, all while sustaining continuous enemy fire. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was frequently criticized for being overly cautious, achieved total operational surprise through mass deployment of amphibious trucks. In his official review, he stated, "The adversary anticipated us crossing the Rhine. They did not foresee us driving over it. This difference was disastrous for their resistance." On March 26, General Dwight Eisenhower visited the crossing locations. His response, as recorded by Aide Captain Harry Butcher, was notable. Ike observed the DUKWs moving to and fro like a ferry fleet. Turning to Bradley, he commented, "With these vehicles, every waterway in Germany becomes a road." Bradley answered, "Now the Germans are starting to realize that." The collapse in morale was absolute. Joseph Goebbels' diary for March 26 stated, "The Western Front is untenable. The foe has crossed the Rhine along an extensive sector with novel amphibious vehicles that took us by surprise. Our ultimate natural defense is lost. The conflict is over."